To know my mother is to have had her ask you the question, would you stop bathing for an entire year for $1 million? The way you might envision wrinkled Italian grandmothers scurrying through a village market, holding a Bible and a fistful of oregano, my mom held close her copy of the Book of Questions. It's a small paperback book, chock full of scenarios that will never, ever happen, with the aim of getting people who are not well acquainted to become uncomfortably familiar. Because nothing will unite two strangers more effectively than the question, if you could lock anyone in a room so that you could torment them for a day, who would you choose and how would you torment them? While it sounds weird, my upbringing was actually halfway normal. The halfway part being that every other person I came to know also had a mom who made them uncomfortable. But the topics were a little more germane to them, to the life of a middle-class B-average Doritos-eating suburban teenager. Pedestrian things like, are your friends doing drugs, and does the length of your shorts make you look promiscuous? But that's where the other half of my life interceded. My mother didn't bother with those questions. No, my formative years were spent eating Snackwells while my mom would ask, if you had to be trapped in a TV show for a month, which would you choose? I'd have chosen any of them in those moments. As I waded through homework assignments, my mother would peer creepily from behind the door and whisper, someone you love is brutally murdered and only you know the identity of the killer. Do you seek revenge? What I sought was refuge in the bathroom, like any 16-year-old girl, to study my pores in the mirror, but my mother's voice would slip under the door, if getting an enormous tattoo could save another's life, would you do it? My childhood was like being a permanent guest on the Sally Jessy Raphael show. My mom with her imaginary cue cards and her red glasses perched on her nose. She was ready to delve into the intimate at every chance, and not just with me, with anyone. She asked fellow PTA mothers if they'd injure small animals to absolve their debt. She probed grocery store baggers as to their willingness to disappear into the night, never to be heard from again, to live in prosperity in Mexico. On my first real date as a young adult, I leaned toward the guy across the table, narrowed my heavily lined lids, and asked in a sultry whisper, where in the world would he choose to live if he had no material concerns to consider? He met my gaze and bluntly returned, I don't think about counterfactual situations. Well, my whole life had been based on counterfactual situations, framed with what-ifs and if-you-coulds. I needed air in that moment. I needed space. I needed a dictionary to learn what counterfactual meant. The rest of the date was spent trading pleasantries about work and the paths we each took to New York, but a divide I couldn't see was there, a divide that if I had to guess was called normal. I unknowingly began to cultivate the normal, welcome the space between myself and those I would meet, and even more unknowingly, I was allowing a split to be cleaved between me and my mom. It was easier to go along this way without imagination and inquisition, and I encouraged my mother to abandon the interrogatories for everyone I brought near. I pleaded with her to surrender them for my sake and for theirs. My mom, her face wearied as if I'd asked her to go on without breathing air, whined, but what are we going to talk about? I don't know, weather, flower arrangements, the Kennedy era? Asking my mom to keep to the norms of human conversation was a lot like watching an American backpacker in a strange land, straining to speak to the locals without glancing at her phrase book. Like a polite interloper, she would use a lot of sweeping hand gestures and compliment the other's cuisine and favorable public transit. What I never realized then was that my mom didn't really want to know what crime a person would commit if it added years to their life. She didn't actually care which sibling they might sacrifice if it guaranteed long lives for the others. Nor was she really interested in the kinky behaviors they might indulge in if it led to cancer's cure. What my mom loved in asking those questions was the act of having a conversation. The tete-a-tete, the chemical reaction that occurs between people who take the cork off their pondering. These days, where you're less apt to find an illuminated mind than an illuminated face from a screen, or more prone to whine about a flight than laugh about a flight of fancy, my mom still cares to know what lives inside of the people she meets. And so it began to dawn on me that maybe it was the rest of us that are socially uncomfortable and not my mother. It became no longer embarrassing to find her sitting on a bench at the mall talking to a complete stranger. I smiled instead of cringed when she would turn toward a neighboring table at a restaurant and ask not just what they ordered, but if they were enjoying it. I let my mom have her hypotheticals with everyone else, while I mostly steered clear. Until one day, I had finished my grocery shopping and was loading the sacks into the back of my car when I saw out of the periphery a bill fluttering in the grassy shoulder of the parking lot. $20 was sitting there with a come hither wave. As I turned the bill over in my hands, wondering what I should do about it, my kids yelled for some of the blueberries we had bought. I fished out the basket and popped it open, only to find something very out of place among the blueberries. There was a die, not a pair of dice, just one die. The universe had handed me $20 and a die in one breath. Clearly, a higher being was trying to impart something of importance to me, which I then tried to impart to everyone I crossed paths with later in the day, but no one took the bait. No one really felt like discussing the counterfactual. So I called my mom. She, as you might imagine, was dumbstruck by the items I found. She wanted to understand every move I had made preceding the acquisition of my tokens and every step to follow. She wanted to know what I thought it meant and what I felt I needed to do about it. She wanted to call every friend to ask what they thought it meant and what they thought they should do about it. She wondered if I should donate the money to a shelter or buy a lottery ticket with it. While she didn't know what to do, she wanted to talk about every combination to this Rubik's Cube, and she insisted we both continue to eat an all-blueberry diet until the divine answers to our counterfactual questions were revealed. And for once, I agreed. Thank you.